our world has come so far, and we would all agree that, nutrition and exercise are foundational. You got to eat right. You got to work out. You got to move. But where we sit today, there is a loneliness epidemic. And the health implications, I think, are more serious than I think we're beginning to understand how serious they are. Pre-COVID in 2019, there was a study out of Cigna that said only half of Americans have meaningful IRL daily connection.
Pre-COVID,
2019. Imagine what that looks like today. Today, if you look at the loneliness epidemic, we're off the COVID levels where I think it was almost a quarter of all Americans were lonely. Now that number is 17%, but almost a quarter of young adults under 30 are lonely. Now, if you think about, okay, what are the health implications of this? If you are lonely, if you look in terms of whether risks for premature death, being lonely is equated with smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow.
So, okay, 15 cigarettes a day, I'm lonely. It is also, it is twice as worse. Being lonely is twice as worse as having 6 drinks a day. That's 42 drinks a week.
And why being, I mean, you're probably going to explain it, but why does it equate to that?
So let me go down the list and I'll come back to it. So we've got smoking, drinking, then lack of physical activity. It is 3 times as worse. Being lonely is 3 times as worse. And then being lonely is 4 times as worse as being obese. And so if you go back to like the mental health epidemic, when people lose hope, when they lose connection, there are serious consequences for our health and well-being. And it's something we don't talk enough about. Like if someone's ever struggled with their mental health, like that's really hard to regain. And when you're lacking that connection, all sorts of things start to go wrong in the body. There are studies that will say essentially exercise and nutrition can lower your risk for premature death, more or less the same, the 20-40% range. But having real meaningful relationships, being in a loving partnership can lower premature death by 45%. And so this is out there, the studies are there, and like we are lacking connection, we're lacking joy, we need to have fun, we need to be with each other. I think we've learned the hard way.
I think that makes total sense because normally people who are elderly are alone and they obviously end up dying. And I look at some elderly people, and a part of that probably is because they're lacking connection.
Yes.
My grandmother passed away in 90, and she was constantly on the move with tons of friends and working with me. And we had sushi nights, and she constantly had connection. And then I look at someone else's grandmother who's sort of locked in the house and hibernates and agoraphobic, and they end up dying sooner. So that makes total sense. Do you think that the reason that we're seeing such a surge in loneliness is because of social media?
I think it's all the above. I think it's social media. I think it's the lockdowns. I think so many of the younger generation have lost the art of communication. I think it's 1 out of 7 women don't have a single friend. Excuse me, that's 1 out of 7 men don't have a single friend.
Wow.
1 out of 10 women don't have a single friend. If you think about that, it's sad.
Yeah, and I hate to be ageist, but we're all relatively the same age. And I think we're like, I saw about
you guys are much younger than
not
us.
too much younger though. Like, what is it? Maybe
I'm 48.
Okay, so like
and
a decade.
Colleen's 43. Well, you'd be 44 in a month.
Okay, but
Thanks
still,
do not add numbers
know,
to my
I'm with
age.
you. Okay,
She's 43.
Do not add numbers.
I'll be 49 in November,
Yeah,
so
do
you
not-
can add.
okay,
add
speak
so
for
too.
yourself.
So yeah, it's 12. But I think, we are one of the last we're in the same last generation to kind of grow up prior to having phones, social media,
Yeah.
all these things. Like you kind of had to figure out all your social interactions. Like Lauren and I got our smartphones when we graduated college. So basically grew up, without all these things. So you actually had to have a human interaction. If I wanted to meet a girl, I had to actually go speak to somebody. If I wanted to have a friend, I actually had to go meet up with them and do things. I think so many people now, they just like, it's at their fingertips, especially when it comes to dating. You're just like swiping and tapping and all these things. And I'm not opposed to these things, but I do think it makes some of these human interactions a little bit artificial. And I talk to our younger siblings and some of their friends, and they're complaining about these things that just weren't issues when we were coming up. And even, we were joking that I'm telling people to get back in the office, but there's a lot of young people that work in the company. I'm like, listen, I know you like the lifestyle of having the flexibility of wanting to be at home, but there's something to be said about being around other people and going to lunch and getting coffee and getting drinks and going and like even if you're wasting time and you feel like that meeting's kind of useless, it's about being around other people.
100%. My all-time favorite study, which is in the book, is the Roseto study. And Roseto was a small town in rural Pennsylvania in the 1950s. In the 1950s, this is when heart disease arrives in America, the exception of Roseto. Men under 55 had half the rate of cardiovascular disease than the rest of America. 65, half the rate. Under 55, non-existent, no heart disease.
By the way, you are phenomenal at remembering stats, but keep going.
It's all the caffeine I drink. I'm also very, very pro black coffee. That should be in the book.
Keep going. I don't want to derail you, but I'm just saying
tequila and mezcal last night.
This is
so it's
very
working
good
for me.
recall.
Sorry, Dr. Amen. And so they took a look at Roseto. What are these people doing? Are they doing NAD injections? Are they, I'm joking. It's 1950s. They are drinking, they are smoking, they are having meatballs, they are having pasta, and they're like puzzled, like, we don't get it. They're doing all the things you shouldn't do. They take a closer look. These people had like the strongest social connections. Multi-generational living was paramount. Grandparents were living with grandchildren. They were the drinking and the smoking was in celebration. They were parades and parties. People were knocking on each other's doors, and that was the context for this. And guess what? 1960s comes, community starts to break apart, people move away, heart disease catches up with the national average in Roseto. And if you think about it, like, that's a pretty unbelievable experiment, and we kind of did the opposite of that in the last couple of years. And I think for me, that's a good reminder, because look, I like the gadgets, the things. I got the Oura, I got the Whoop, I've tried all the diets. Like, I like working out. I'm trying to, gain lean muscle mass right now as I'm starting to age and shrink. But it's something I need to think about.